underscore that social memory studies, cognitive memory studies, are somewhat of a different beast. Although I was privileged to read some of the most recent work of Alan Crook on the recent developments of cognitive memory in Germany and in the States, and that work too is increasingly looking more and more like Hoblox's and Osman's type of work. It's emphasizing the culturally scripted nature in memory when it's first embedded, not just when it's articulated. But I'm not going to pursue that very far here. I just want to underscore that for these three scholars, Hoblox, Osman, and Schwartz, for each of them, social memory theory is not primarily about discovering or recovering the actual past. For Hoblox, that is actually the precise opposite of collective memory. Things are different for Osman and Schwartz, but not because they think social memory theory is about the actual past. Rather, they view history and memory as related instead of opposites. For Hoblox, history and memory are opposites. For Osman and Schwartz, they're different because they reject the historical positivism of Hoblox. For Osman and Schwartz, the theory primarily addresses continuities and discontinuities in the development of memory culture. One can put it to use for historiographical purposes, but that is not its primary focus. Or to say it another way, although the historian may decide to take further steps of understanding or imagining the actual past, he or she cannot do so without taking the initial steps of understanding the commemorative practices by which it reached him or her. The theory itself, however, is most concerned with those practices, not the actual past. Number one, transmission of the oral gospel tradition and form criticism. Although not receiving the kind of attention that social memory theory has received in historical Jesus studies, by far the most matured area of application of social memory theory and gospels research concerns the transmission of the oral Jesus tradition. Many scholars have found social memory theory's descriptions of the dynamic relationships between the present and the past a useful framework for conceptualizing the transmission of the oral tradition. Rafael Rodriguez has written a full monograph on the topic, and Eric Eve has also employed the memory approach in his overview of the scholarly discussion, both of which are very, very excellent volumes. Since the formation and transmission of the oral Jesus tradition was the focus of form criticism, it is little surprise that many applications of social memory theory in this area have engaged form criticism and its lingering effects in gospel scholarship. Many of these assessments have been critical in light of its near total emphasis upon the Sitzenleben der Kirche, whether Hellenistic or Palestinian, but the emphasis upon the Sitzenleben der Kirche over the Sitzenleben Jesu. Gospel scholars, as well as social memory theorists outside of biblical studies, have identified form criticism as a thoroughly presentist perspective. Although he was merely repeating the earlier opinion of Bultmann, Paul Winter's assessment of the controversy narrative serves as a clear example of this presentist tendency. He says, quote, "All the Markan controversy stories, without exception, reflect disputes between the apostolic church and its social environment and are devoid of roots in the circumstances of the life of Jesus." End quote. From the continuity perspective of social memory theory, this failure to consider seriously the ways in which the past could have contributed to early Christians' presence is a severe oversight. In other words, even if Winter is true that they're imagining these things, it does not answer the question of why they are and why they're taking the shape that they are. In other words, why was there a controversy that produced these imaginations? Previous typologies provide categories for the present, and thus structure or restrain the interpretive freedom of the present to an extent as groups assimilate the novum to the known. In some instances, such as the descriptive violence of crucifixion, the past presses itself more forcibly upon the present, even while the present scrambles to find typological frames with which to master the shattering of group identity. The past does not always pressure the present in this manner, but examples such as this point to a much more complex interaction between the present and the past than form criticism's unidirectional theory of the transmission of the oral Jesus tradition can accommodate. Another area in which gospel scholars have been critical of form criticism is its treatment of the shift between the oral and the written tradition. Although this shift served as the crucial threshold between early Palestinian Christianity and later Hellenistic Christianity, Bultmann famously regarded the transition as, quote, nothing in principle new, but only a completion of what was begun in the oral tradition, end quote. In 1983, Kelber persuasively argued on the basis of the dynamics of oral tradition that the textualization of Mark's gospel was not a logical, evolutionary, or organic process, as Bultmann and others imagined. Rather, and as Graham Stanton had also earlier observed, somehow Stanton gets forgotten completely in this discussion, but as Graham Stanton had also earlier observed, it is a significant alteration to the Jesus tradition that requires explanation. Jan Osman's concept of cultural memory adds considerable weight to Kelber's and Stanton's contention. Here, the textualization of tradition is a reconstitution of identity marking efforts that occurs at the crossroads of communicative and cultural memory. It's thus an important step on the path toward canonization. In Kelber's later work, he has adopted Osman's cultural memory model, and so have Alan Kirk, Joanne Dewey, and I, each in our own ways. We don't all agree with each other, but we've all found this to be good. Applications of memory theory to early Christian media transitions have not focused singly on the Gospel of Mark, however. In his and Kirk's seminal 2005 Semea volume on social memory theory, Tom Thatcher addressed the Gospel of John's transition from oral to written tradition. Thatcher observes that the Johannine author's concept of spirit-enabled memory of Jesus that leads into all truth, John 14:26 and 16:13, runs against the common scholarly concept that a Christian moved Johannine gospel tradition to book form in order to meet an archival view. In other words, working with the logic of the Gospel of John, you don't need a book to remember. You only need the Spirit. So why did he get Mike to write a book? Thatcher therefore suggests that John's Gospel was textualized in order to draw upon the rhetorical value of text as material artifacts in order to seal a particular Christology. Finally, form criticism's division of the Gospel tradition into traditions that reflect the past, the Sitzenleben Jesu, or the present, the Sitzenleben der Kirche, stands in direct opposition to Hoblock's and others' insights concerning memory formation. If all memory is constructed from the perspective of the present, there is no tradition or memory that can be extricated from those present social frameworks. From this perspective, the concomitant form-critical notion that one could sift through the layers of the Jesus tradition in order to excavate earlier tradition from later ecclesiastical accretions is thoroughly misguided, and I'll return to this. By the way, I use square quotes, not coats, or scare quotes. Scare quotes on tradition and memory, because as you'll soon figure out on this panel, tradition and memory mean each a million different things. Every person that's in this discussion has a different understanding of what those words mean. So, in light of these critical assessments of form criticism, one could easily get the impression that scholars employing the memory approach have been only critical of form criticism, and Dr. Foster intimates this in his recent article. I think this perspective is incorrect. Scholars have also used social memory theory in order to underscore form criticism's lasting contributions and build upon them. One obvious affirmation of form criticism by social memory theory is the pivotal role that form criticism assigned to the present, Sitzenleben, of the transmitters of the gospel tradition. Although they were wrong to neglect the past, they were entirely right to highlight the significance of the present. In addition, scholars have affirmed, augmented, or rehabilitated specific aspects of form criticism from a memory perspective. And here I'm thinking the work of Samuel Bierskog has developed a concept of the Sitzenleben in light of social memory theory. Bierskog has also developed a perspective on Kriya as mnemonic devices. In other words, these bits of tradition that transmitted together. And Ruben Zimmermann also has done a lot of work on parables as a mnemonic device. And all of these, along with some of the work of Alan Kirk, has emphasized that, as Kirk says, social memory theory in many ways takes over prominent aspects of form criticism and develops them. These appropriations of social memory theory stand generally in the line of Osman's cultural memory theory, which moved Hoblock's original insights more intentionally into the ancient media culture. Furthermore, they demonstrate that New Testament scholars who have appropriated social memory theory have been neither oblivious to its similarities to form criticism nor solely negative to form criticism. Number two, the criteria of authenticity. The relationship between social memory theory and form criticism also stands at the crux of another important issue in gospel studies, the criteria of authenticity. The criteria of authenticity are no strangers to criticism, and this criticism reached an apex in this wonderful book from 2012. It's a damn fine volume, if I do say so myself. You can pick it up out there. They're no strangers to criticism, but scholars approaching them from the perspective of social memory theory have heightened that criticism by focusing particularly on the problematic assumption that lies at their very core, namely that scholars can separate authentic Jesus tradition from inauthentic Jesus tradition. As is clear in the writings of Casemont and others, the criteria approach inherited directly from form criticism the assumption that scholars can separate the gospel tradition into two piles, one of which reflects the past of Jesus and the other of which reflects the present of the early Christians, crafting, fabricating, and transmitting the traditions. As I've already discussed, however, the base assertion of sociological approaches to memory, from Hoblock's to the present day and across the spectrum of presentism and the continuity perspective, is that all memory is inextricably bound to the social frameworks of the present that enable the articulation and conceptualization of the past. If this is the case, then the assumption that scholars can separate and recover historical reality from the individual or group interpretation of that reality is problematic. Jeffrey Ulrich says, if experience is always embedded in and occurs through narrative frames, then there is no primal, unmediated experience that can be recovered. The distinction between history and memory in such accounts is a matter of disciplinary power rather than of epistemological privilege. Or, as Rafael Rodriguez notes, quote, memory does not preserve the past in a way that allows for the separation of historical fact and later interpretation. Quote. I really want to underscore here, though, that Rodriguez does not claim that historians are incapable of making informed decisions about historical fact and later interpretation. He asserts only that the tradition itself cannot be separated in that manner. Number three, the new historiography. This rather simple observation about the inseparable nature of past reality and present interpretation has toppled a very long-standing method in historical Jesus studies because it requires a redefinition of history and memory that does not hold these two concepts in opposition by defining the former as the past that historians recover from interpretations in the sources, and defining the latter as interpretations in the sources from which the past must be recovered. This shift in memory theory dovetails with similar developments in theories of history and orality studies. Applications of these theories to the Gospels collectively represent a new historiography in historical Jesus studies that breaks sharply from the atomistic criteria approach and similar approaches that focus on isolated sayings or actions of Jesus. Jens Schroeder has consistently led these efforts to construct neutestamentliche Wissenschaftseinsights des Historismus. It is notable, I think, that Foster's and Crook's recent criticisms of social memory applications in gospel studies fail to engage his work. Already in 2011, Ruben Zimmermann could rightly refer to Schroeder's studies as bahnbrechend and indicate that scholars have recognized it as such for some time already. In very general terms, Schroeder proposes that every approach to the historical Jesus behind the Gospels has to explain how these writings could have come into being as the earliest descriptions of this person. Insofar as this approach therefore grounds historical Jesus inquiry in the past as portrayed in our extant sources, it is similar to what Osman labeled mnemo-history, which also foregrounds the texts and traditions that they stand before historians. Related directly to this fact, Schroeder has insisted that one cannot neatly separate past and present history and interpretation due to their intertwined and mutually dependent natures in commemorative activity. He instead proposed in 1997 an approach to the historical Jesus that sought to explain those connections, foreshadowing the demise of the criteria of authenticity in similar approaches. Now, the role of the actual past in the new historiography is a less than straightforward issue. Some scholars remain interested in positing a historical reality behind the Gospels. Others think that we can't even talk sensibly about that. Jens Schroeder, Dale Allison, and I at least agree that scholars can offer hypotheses about how things could have been. We can take informed guesses. This affirmation requires clear articulation because it's open to misunderstanding. All concerned acknowledge that the actual past is not accessible. By affirming that scholars can theorize a historical Jesus behind the Gospels, this approach does not assume that scholars can access an uninterpreted past reality, much less that they can do so by dispensing with the interpretive categories in the Gospels. These are the assumptions of form criticism, the criteria of authenticity, and the historical positivism to which they give expression. In stark contrast, the new historiography affirms that there is no access to the past apart from the interpretive categories of the sources. Quote, and this is Alan Kirk, quote, "It is only through the transmutation of formative events into transmissible tradition artifacts that the past is preserved at all." In other words, it's only in the interpretation that we find any influence of the past at all. Thus, in response to Sandy Wedderburn, Jens Schroeder states, quote, "Of course, I do not deny that there is a reality to which texts like the Gospels refer, but this does not mean that I would presuppose that this reality is accessible independently of the sources. The decisive point is that we have access to the past only by critical interpretation of the sources and never independently of them." Or, as Zimmermann eloquently put, "Es gibt keine Historie jenseits des Textes, aber es gibt Historie durch den Text und als Text." There is no history on the other side of the text, but there is history through the text and as text. The new historiography in Jesus studies preserves a possible role for the actual past in the production of social memory as part, and only one part, of a larger concern to take seriously the impact of the inertia of the commemorated past upon the formation of memory in the present in general. And I think I'll stop and just pause here for a second and underscore this. When most of us who are applying social memory theory to the Gospels talk about the past, we are not talking about what really happened. We're talking about the inertia of received interpretations. That statement in and of itself does not assume whether those interpretations are accurate or historically inaccurate. It only recognizes the fact that commemorative and interpretive activity in the present is not a free-for-all. As noted earlier, this approach marks a clear difference with form criticism, and it's unfortunate that several scholars overlook this point in claiming that the insights that social memory theory offers have already been offered by form criticism. Certainly, this approach shares with form criticism a concern to understand and explain the Jesus tradition in light of its present community functions. Unlike form criticism, however, the new historiography insists that any given present community, as well as the Jesus tradition it transmits, is itself constituted by the received past. Thus, scholarly inquiry does not stop at observing coinciding elements of the Jesus tradition and community identity. It also asks programmatically about how the inherited past places pressure upon and even forms those present form frameworks in various ways. I want to make a transition to the discussion of the historical reliability of the Gospels, but I also want to make a statement in light of the rest of our discussion. Zed and Paul have both pointed out that some scholars use social memory theory and what looks like attempts to affirm the historical reliability of the Gospels, and I have no qualm with that. I agree. I think that they're right in pointing out that some scholars do that. But I want to emphasize that not everyone does, so I'd like to provide some quotations here. Jens Schroeder says, quote, "It is not the sources themselves which tell the historian what he or she has to say," end quote. I have written, quote, "This methodology does not comment upon or assume the historical reliability of those perceptions at the outset," end quote. Alan Kirk has said, these mnemonically shaped Jesus traditions give us no royal road to the historical Jesus. End quote. Dale Allison has said, quote, I should emphatically add, urging that all stories in the Gospels must be historical, end quote. And Sandra Hubenthal has said, quote, reading New Testament texts as communicative Gedächtnis means that one cannot presume to know exactly how the events memorialized in the text really took place. End quote. As this discussion has revealed, undoubtedly the greatest source of contention between critics and supporters of social memory theory and gospel scholarship has been the employment of the theory in arguments for the historical reliability of the Gospels. Bauckham, Bachmuel, Keener, McIver, and others have appealed to memory studies and arguments for the general historical reliability of the Gospel tradition, or at least the fact that it goes back to eyewitnesses. Foster, Crook, and others, Wedderburn, have countered that memory studies either fail to favor the historical reliability of the Gospels or, in fact, favor the historical unreliability of the Gospels. In light of these claims, I need to reiterate that the majority of scholars do not use it to those ends. And so I want to close on a statement about what it actually does. Social memory theory makes a definitive contribution to the new historiography in Jesus studies, but fanfare and fears of its implications for historical reliability have at times been equally misplaced. Pronouncements on the historical reliability of the Gospels remain as anchored in scholarly argumentation and proposals for plausible historical scenarios as they always have been. What's new in the new historiography is not the conclusions that scholars reach, but rather how scholars use the extant sources in reaching their conclusions. The new historiographers no longer see the Jesus tradition as we have it in the Gospels as the raw materials with which we start and then must purify down to historically useful data by separation from early Christian interpretation. The tradition is now viewed as a finished commemorative product that need not be dissected so much as accounted for. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Zeba Crook on memory distortion and the historical Jesus. I guess, do you want your PowerPoint, right?
That was a great start, and I'm very excited and honored to be here. Unlike some of my this hallowed panel, I'm a newcomer to memory theory. I have to start with a deeply shameful confession that I am the illegitimate love child. Come on. This only works. I'm the illegitimate love child of a long-standing love affair between historical positivism and the Jesus Seminar. As with all parentage, this relationship left an enduring impact on me. I believe, and I have taught many students to believe, that logical, rigorous, and reasonable criteria could be applied to the sayings of Jesus, allowing us to reverse a process of accretion, adaptation, and calcification in order to arrive at something sometimes more and sometimes less reliable, kernels of utterances that came directly from Jesus' lips. Like the Jesus Seminar, I was not overly optimistic about the number of these kernels. Some things had been altered beyond recognition and others invented outright. In other words, when I encountered memory theory a number of years ago, I was not naive about the invention of Jesus material among early Christians. But I was, like the Jesus Seminar, I contend, utterly naive about the way groups disremember the past. I believed that the proper application of rigorous criteria could lead us to the reconstruction of the past as it actually happened. How embarrassing. And unfortunately, I can't even attribute this to doing crack during one of my many times. Probably approximately a year ago, to quote the world's most famous mayor. As memory theory has entered into New Testament studies, a few shifts have emerged. There are some New Testament scholars who find, as you heard just from Chris, who find in memory theory cause for confidence in the reliability of the Gospels, McIver, Dunn, Keener, but others are decidedly more pessimistic, Kelber, Kloppenborg, Dooling, Williams, and Allison. I count myself obviously among the latter group. In defense of the former group of scholars, though, the transition in memory studies from confidence in memory, or thinking about memory as a stable process involving the straightforward retrieval of data from our memory bank, has been a slow one. What has replaced it in so very much work on memory in the last 20 years is the position that memory is not something that is retrieved, but something that is reconstructed in every act of remembering. And it is in this act of reconstruction that memory is prone to distortion. All memory theorists who work on distortion are quick to point out that to say that memory is prone to distortion does not mean that all memory is hopelessly distorted. But it does mean that the problem of memory distortion cannot be ignored, which prior to 1995 it more or less had been, and in biblical studies still commonly is. I would contend that scholars who think that memory theory confirms the reliability of the Gospels have not adequately engaged the literature on memory distortion. It is not the case that there is only one way to respond to memory distortion, as can be seen in the thoughtful work of Anthony LeDunn, Chris Keith, Tom Thatcher, among others. But it is the case that the characteristics of memory distortion are every bit as sobering as Dale Allison recently lamented. Memory distortion matters, but it took scholars a significant amount of time to come around to this fact. This is likely because it is a human tendency to trust memory. Memory is so related to our perceptions of ourselves, the world around us, and our place in it, that our memories normally feel strongly and reliably rooted in us. Recent work in memory theory has been challenging this notion. A decade before the serious work on memory distortion began, Hobsbawm and Ranger presented a short collection of essays on the wholesale invention of tradition. The essays in that volume focused on the British Commonwealth, from Highland and Welsh culture to Indian and African colonial experiences. Together, these essays reveal that time and again, from location to location, traditions, quote, which appear or claim to be old, are quite often quite recent in origins and sometimes invented, unquote. The mid-1990s saw a veritable explosion of work on memory distortion. I shall build the conversation around the study by Roy Baumeister and Stephen Hastings, even though theirs wasn't the earliest, because theirs has a structure to it that others often lacked. Baumeister and Hastings offered a perceptive discussion of how groups distort the past. Their particular interest concerned the manner in which, quote, memory can be manipulated for the purpose of collective self-deception, unquote. Centrally important here is the agency exercised by groups in manipulating memory. This is different from accidental forgetting, which does not presume agency. This manipulation is deliberate because it is done for a purpose, usually to reflect well on the group. Baumeister and Hastings take it as axiomatic that, quote, most social groups wish to maintain a positive image of themselves, unquote, and I would add to that, of their founding figures. Baumeister and Hastings find evidence of 7 strategies or mechanisms for deliberate distortion of collective memory. These are linking versus detachment, that is, presenting or adhering to or rejecting certain causal connections between events, or blaming the enemy, that is, making your own misdeeds appear to be a measured reaction, for instance, rather than an overreaction or an unprovoked attack, selective omission of disagreeable facts, exaggeration and embellishment, blaming the circumstances, contextual framing, and the outright invention of false memories. I have placed these not in their order, but in the order of degree of distortion, wherein rejecting causal connections between events is a minor form of distortion, and invention a major form. The first 4 of these tend not to change the past. They merely try to alter what the past means or how it unfolded. For example, most major events have a complex constellation of causes. When a group wishes to control how a past event is understood, say the invasion of a country, they might focus on only one cause, ethics, ignoring other causes, economics, in such a way that legitimizes their actions. Thus, for some groups, the invasion of a country for their oil is a sign of corruption and greed, but doing so in order to save an oppressed people is legitimate. This form of memory distortion is called linking or detaching. Likewise, not denying a past event, one can choose to blame the victim. This is commonly done in German explanations for the 1941 invasion of Russia. Though they were by treaty allies, Germany often claims to have feared imminent attack from Russia, so they present their attack as justifiable, especially given their much smaller size. And if blaming the enemy is not an option, blaming circumstances might be. The event might still be embarrassing, but this strategy helps to shift the blame away from you. And for instance, emphasizing that war is ugly and has odious collateral damage is an example of blaming circumstances, say, in the event of the deaths of civilians. Finally, one's context determines how one frames or distorts the past, since being a member of a group will outfit one with the most flattering version of events. Thus, Christians tend to remember the Crusades as about freeing other Christians in Muslim lands, while Muslims tend to remember the Crusades as the first in the long line of unprovoked invasions. Now, what sets these first four strategies of memory distortion apart from the three that follow is that the first four do not attempt to change the past. In linking versus detaching, blaming the enemy or circumstances, or contextual framing, groups accept the occurrence of an embarrassing event, but their memory distortion attempts to reduce the embarrassment or to explain in a distorting way why the event was necessary or justified. The next three strategies are much more highly distorting because they deal with the past by actively changing it. Selective omission, as the name suggests, is about ignoring certain events or facts from the past. The frequency with which this strategy can be found in group narratives suggests it is easily executed. So, for instance, the collective memory of founding American figures such as Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Patrick Henry often omit the opinions and practices they had concerning slavery. But selective omission is not only a memory distortion strategy of the liberal left. The conservative right often selectively omits from their collective memories images of Jesus excoriating wealth or helping the poor. Michael Kamen shares this opinion about the distorting power of selective remembering. His study shows that, quote, memories can readily, with scant embarrassment or challenge, be quietly repressed within a generation and replaced by alternate explanations, end of quote. Distorting collective memory for reasons of nationalistic cohesion or self-confidence or flattering self-representation is found in countries the world over. Exaggeration and embellishment of memory can be mild, like earlier forms of distortion, but it also has the potential to be distortive to the extent that a whole new memory is created. This potential is missed by Baumeister and Hastings, who limit the effects of exaggeration and embellishment. So clearly crediting Christopher Columbus with discovering North America when 60 million people already lived here is moderately distortive. But one can easily exaggerate or embellish an event so extensively that it becomes a unique event in and of itself. One could speculate whether something like this might stand behind some of the miracles of Jesus, say, where a few fed in an act of radical commensality becomes a feeding of several thousand with a few loaves. The final and more extreme strategy of memory distortion is fabrication. Yet here is where Baumeister and Hastings are least satisfactory. They offer one example and conclude that, quote, outright fabrication of collective memory is rare, end of quote. Several features are problematic about this claim. First of all, what do they mean by fabrication? For instance, as I raised earlier, at what point is a memory so thoroughly exaggerated or embellished that it becomes a new and therefore fabricated memory? Secondly, what constitutes rarity? They suggest, quote, an example or two, unquote, would be hard to find and call it extreme. The third problem extends from here. The outright fabrication of memory is simply far more common than they admit. It is not hard to see how wrong Baumeister and Hastings were concerning the rarity of fabricated collective memory. If nothing else, they might have considered some of the patently implausible things that groups have believed over the centuries. That Jewish men menstruate, that a snake spoke to the first woman, that the Torah was identically translated from Hebrew into Greek by 72 scholars in 72 days, that the world was created by the slaying of a giant serpent. The bottom line is that people can be deeply committed to narratives that have no basis in reality, and they continue to be so. There is one final point that I must make about distorted memory, and in this setting it must be made briefly. Elizabeth Loftus shows time and again in her studies that manufactured memories and factual memories are utterly indistinguishable from each other. And this has been replicated endlessly. Implanted memory of adults, of a fictitious childhood event can be tenaciously maintained by the subject, even in debriefing. This is because the act of remembering is a deeply subjective experience. Memory carries as great an impact when it is veridical as when it is not. So I cannot stress enough, memory theory reveals that those who hold distorted memories and those who analyze others' distorted memory cannot distinguish them from authentic or accurate memories. Let's illustrate this by looking at the Gospel of Matthew. Let us consider the following 10 episodes from Matthew. The slaughter of the innocents and the flight to and from Egypt. The baptism of Jesus. The lengthy sermon delivered on a mountain. The stilling of a storm. The parable of the mustard seed. The feeding of the 5,000 and the key commandments, which I could not find Lego images for. The Jewish mob calling for the blood of Jesus to be placed upon themselves. Anybody?
Tom Wright's favorite.
Yep. The tombs opening and the dead walking around the city of Jerusalem. And the resurrection of Jesus. Of this list of 10 episodes, 4 items involve supernatural elements. The remaining 6 are perfectly mundane, right? Daily. And yet, note that all of them, without exception, is presented as unqualifiedly, absolutely true in the Gospel of Matthew, an actual event in the life of Jesus. My point, Matthew does not indicate that he thinks the dead walking around Jerusalem might be less reliable a memory than Jesus having performed the parable of the mustard seed. It is widely recognized that Matthew himself composed the conversation that takes place between Jesus and John the Baptist at 3:15, and yet he presents it exactly the same way as the remainder of the event, the historicity of which almost nobody doubts. There is little doubt that the Gospel of Matthew contains both distorted memories, say his redaction of the parable of the mustard seed, or situating the Q sermon on a mountain and then greatly expanding it, as well as wholly manufactured memories, the Jewish self-curse and zombies in Jerusalem. While some suggest that the writer of Matthew did not likely believe every story in his gospel, Dale Allison presents a persuasive case that the gospel writers believed their own stories. In other words, consistent with human memory in general, the writer of Matthew himself likely would not have been able to distinguish between accurate memories and invented memories of Jesus that he inherited, and might not have been able to even with memories he himself invented. His confidence in the reliability of all his memories is likely characteristically high, based on countless studies and tests. The challenge is even greater than for us, reading from the distance from which we read these texts. The Gospel of Matthew presents patently invented memory alongside possibly historical memory. Plenty of scholarly debates exist questioning the historical accuracy of many Matthean events, of course, but I must point out this debate exists not with any assistance from Matthew, but wholly in spite of him. That is to say, there are no internal hints, no syntactical or grammatical markings, no narrative winks or nudges that suggest Matthew might have distinguished between material that went back to Jesus and material that he invented, or that he had received and had reason to doubt. Since there is no marking on any of Matthew's material, on what basis can we say that the dead perambulating Jerusalem is not likely an actual event, but the parable of the mustard seed was? Or that the parable of the mustard seed was performed by Jesus, but that 27:25, the blood curse, was composed by later Christians? Now, it used to be the case that one of the tools at our disposal for distinguishing between historically reliable and historically unreliable material was the traditional form-critical criteria developed over the new and third quests: multiple independent attestation, coherence, embarrassment, and so on. But a recent and in my opinion, extremely important collection of essays has dismantled the usefulness of these criteria, these to which Chris Keith humbly drew your attention. I actually urge you to run, not walk, and get this book, and I'll just wait for you while you do that. That's how important I think this book is. And James is okay with us taking 20 minutes. According to Keith and LeDun and a small group of predecessors, traditional historical Jesus studies is characterized by a number of features. The quest to reconstruct the original, authentic words of Jesus using criteria, the foundation of which is form criticism. The foundational assumption behind form criticism is that there is a linear trajectory from a Jesus speech event to written gospel, and that this trajectory involves a fairly predictable process of accretion, alteration, and adaptation. Because the process is fairly predictable, criteria, in the form listed here, can be applied to the final product in order to reverse this process of accretion, alteration, and adaptation. The problems raised concerning this approach are multiple. First and most seriously, the search for one authentic form of a Jesus saying misses that Jesus would have delivered any speech or story multiple times, and if he was any good at all at his trade, each delivery would have been a little different. Therefore, there cannot be any one authentic form of a performance. Secondly, this one fact has a direct bearing on our ability to neatly separate tradition, that is Jesus, from interpretation, later Christians. It cannot be done. Thirdly, memory theory contributes to this particular point as well. Since all remembering requires interpretation and framing, separating tradition, what is remembered, from interpretation, how it is remembered, is flatly impossible. As Keith observes, quote, "If not for those interpretive frameworks, the past would not survive at all," unquote. And historian Elizabeth Tonkin makes the same point, quote, "Professional historians who use the recollections of others cannot just scan them for useful facts to pick out, like currants from a cake. Any such facts are so embedded in the representation that it directs an interpretation of them, and its very ordering, its plotting, its metaphors bear meaning too," end of quote. Keith, LeDun, and their able contributors declared the criteria approach dead, unable to complete the task for which it was created. In other words, the criteria cannot be used to distinguish between the authentic memory which we hope and expect is in the Gospels and the manufactured or distorted memories which we know is in the Gospels. Where does that leave us? With a new no quest. Memory theory shows us that it is impossible to distinguish between real and distorted memories. And Keith and LeDun show that the tools we always thought could be used for that purpose are irreparably broken. The search for authenticity was the heart of the new and third quests for the historical Jesus, and Keith and LeDun amply show. If the search for authentic material is no longer tenable, then there really is no more quest. There might be other enterprises, other projects, and some of them, such as the quest for the remembered Jesus, might be richly rewarding. But I think it would be false advertising to call it the quest for the historical Jesus, as if we can change the goal of the game from touchdowns to a 2-hour marathon and imagine that it's the same event. If the search for an authentic Jesus has been abandoned rightly and replaced by the remembered Jesus, that is a topic more aligned with reception history than historical reconstruction, then really and truly, there's no more quest. To conclude, to my mind, the value of memory theory is to historical Jesus research is really a disvalue. It does not refine our previous positivistic criteria, allowing us better to distinguish between authentic and inauthentic Jesus material. Neither does it provide a new route by which to discover authentic Jesus material. Rather, I suggest it pushes us ever further away from certainty, from confidence in assessing authentic material, and in distinguishing it from inauthentic material. Keith and LeDun are abundantly correct. There are 2 reasons for this. The first is not merely that memory, both individual and group, is not entirely trustworthy, but how commonly it is untrustworthy. But the second is the far more serious, that there is no way to distinguish between accurate and inaccurate memories. or what I have called manufactured memories elsewhere. To my mind, the most troubling implications of memory theory force us back into no-quest territory, and I find this deeply distressing. Because one of the most powerful lines in defense of historical Jesus research that I've ever read is Don Crossan's line from his three-way debate with Luke Timothy Johnson and Werner Kelber called the Jesus Controversy. He writes, "History is possible because its absence is reprehensible." That is, without confidence in history, in historical reconstruction anywhere in any period on any issue, there can be no hope for justice. I fear a no quest, but this is where memory theory has pushed me. Some people persist in the naive hope that memory theory supports the reliability of the Gospels. Memory theory, according to Keener, argues that although, quote, memory can be imperfect, there are normally limits to this imperfection, i.e., they do not ordinarily involve free composition of events. Even when some details are inaccurate, the gist is usually accurate, end of quote. But there are simply too many instances involving the, quote, free composition of events, end of quote, and for which gist memory is no more reliable than detailed memory. History and lab tests reveal this repeatedly, and they cannot be ignored. I must reject Keener's hopefulness and conclude that finding the historical Jesus is hopeless. But at the same time, I must be equally clear, I have not devolved into hyper-skepticism, as Dale Allison warns against. My no-quest position derives not from an assumption that human memory is inherently unreliable. Yes, there is much evidence to show that human memory is deeply unreliable in a whole host of ways, but nonetheless, I agree with Daniel Schachter that memory works well most of the time. What pushes me into no-quest territory, I stress, is not that memory is never reliable, but that reliable and unreliable memories are indistinguishable from one another. To the person who holds the memories, and even more seriously, to the outsider analyzing the memories. And as gospel scholars, we are outsiders analyzing other people's memories. Thank you.
Okay, our third speaker is Rafael Rodriguez, an uneasy Concord, memory and history in contemporary Jesus research.
The early 20th century saw the rise of memory as an analytical category in the practice of critical historiography. Morris Hawwalks coined the term collective memory and located the structure or the framework of memory in social and cultural forces outside the individual. However, the rise of memory emerged from a broader academic plot than Hawwalks and French sociology. To quote Astrid Erl, memory studies was an international and transdisciplinary phenomenon from the very beginning, close quote. After the Second World War, the academic interest in memory waned until the 1980s, when memory studies once again emerged as an international and transdisciplinary phenomenon. As an academic discipline, biblical studies bumped up against the new memory studies periodically throughout the 1990s. However, it was not until the early 2000s that memory studies penetrated biblical scholarship. In 2003, James Dunn's mammoth volume, Jesus Remembered, explicitly highlighted the role of memory and oral tradition as the medium of transmission between the historical Jesus and the written Gospels, especially the Synoptics, though Dunn did not engage the burgeoning and interdisciplinary study of memory. 2 years later, Alan Kirk and Tom Thatcher formally and programmatically introduced memory studies to biblical scholarship, first by means of Alan Kirk's précis of social and cultural memory, and second, by means of a series of essays exploring the intersection of memory studies and Christian origins. In the 8 years since Kirk and Thatcher's Semaya Studies volume, literally dozens of monographs, dissertations, and articles have been and are being published that take some measure or account of memory studies and apply those studies to the historical and literary questions of biblical studies. The thriving discussion around and application of memory studies has even included the direct contribution of some of the memory theorists in question, including Jeffrey K. Olick, who has an essay in BTV from 2006, and Barry Schwartz, who's published a number of volumes and participated in a number of conferences, including SBL. Memory theory, or better, memory theories, shows every sign of waxing rather than waning among biblical and related research. Now, among all this dynamic activity, we should not be surprised to find considerable disagreement about both the dynamics of memory and its significance for our questions. The most well-known appeals to memory studies for historical scholarship arguably, and probably, come from conservative quarters. I'm thinking of Bauckham and Keener and some of the people that Zeb noted. But it would be wrong to think that only or even primarily conservative scholars have embraced memory studies. Some of the more prominent advocates of memory theory include April DeClonic, Richard Horsley, Werner Kelber, and Jan Schroeder, none of whom give any indication of harboring a conservative ideological or theological perspective. Others may or may not identify as variously conservative or traditional scholars, but their use of memory studies has not been overtly or even subtly apologetically motivated, and I would include my own work here, of course. As with any new field of inquiry, the discussion is diverse and pulls in multiple and sometimes conflicting directions. However, the use of memory studies among biblical studies has reached critical mass, and among biblical scholars, the discussion of memory is most dynamic among historians of ancient Israel and the historical Jesus. By the end of 2013, the question for historians of Jesus has shifted from, is memory relevant for historical Jesus research, to how does memory affect historical Jesus research, despite protests to the contrary. In an attempt to answer this latter question, I will argue that memory studies poses significant challenges to the traditional task of historical Jesus research, even as it offers suggestive ways forward. Now I want to pause for just a second and warn you that my paper is going to echo and in two places quote the very same passages that we've already heard. My paper is more similar, of course, to Chris Keats than to Zeb's. The fact that the program book has Chris going before me should not obscure the fact that there is a charge of plagiarism on the table.
Again.
First, I'd like to describe the traditional Jesus historiography. For all the debate over how to isolate and identify historical information about Jesus, historians generally agree about the basic nature of the problem facing them. Robert Miller, in his introduction to the debate over whether Jesus shared an apocalyptic worldview, offers a clear formulation of the problem, and I'll quote Miller at length. Quote, all critical scholars agree that the Gospels contain both historically reliable material based on memories about Jesus and historically unreliable material based on his followers' interpretations of his life, death, and teaching. The task of historical criticism is to analyze this complex blend of memory and interpretation in order to distinguish what should be attributed to the historical Jesus and what should be attributed either to progressive elaboration by the rank and file of early Christians who passed on the stories about him, or the focused creativity of the individual gospel writers, close quote. Key there is complex blend. John Meyer, whose approach to an understanding of Jesus differs markedly from Bob Miller, shares this basic perspective. In 1991, he set out on a massive quest to isolate the historically authentic material from later interpretive editions, and as he would describe it 3 years later, quote, as much as possible to let any overarching interpretation of Jesus and his work emerge gradually and naturally out of the convergence of the data judged historical, close quote. Despite developments in the historical study of Jesus since Meyer published the first volume of A Marginal Jew, Meyer has not adjusted or updated his approach to Jesus historiography in light of the developments. And here I would point you to the section at the beginning of Volume 4 of A Marginal Jew, copyrighted 2009, so 18 years after the first volume. Once again, a reminder about the rules of the road, where Meyer just recapitulates the same rules he's been doing for 18 years. This is the stability of his method, despite the way the field has moved. But even more creative historians, who do not content themselves with playing the same game only better, and who spent considerable time and energy and even ink thinking about the game itself, end up offering criteria designed to assist in the task of differentiating historical from interpretive tradition. For example, rather than jettisoning the criterion of double dissimilarity, which does not at all serve his historiographical interests, N.T. Wright couples it with a criterion of double similarity. Similarly, James Dunn offers a broad brush criterion that precedes his analysis of any of the Jesus tradition's particular detail. Quote, any feature which is characteristic within the Jesus tradition and relatively distinctive of the Jesus tradition is most likely to go back to Jesus. That is, to reflect the original impact made by Jesus' teaching and actions on several, at least, of his first disciples, close quote. Unlike Meyer, neither Wright nor Dunn set out simply to differentiate authentic from inauthentic traditions. However, the rhetoric and logic of criteria, which were designed for the more traditional tasks of sifting and lifting authentic traditions from their context in the Gospels, continues to exert its influence over Wright's and Dunn's more holistic analyses of the Jesus tradition. And despite that sweeping generalization in Robert Miller's claim that all critical scholars agree, these are his words, all critical scholars agree, despite that sweeping generalization, some critical scholars have exhibited considerable discomfort at this way of thinking about our sources and our historiographical task. Already in 1998, Dale Allison sensed that the primary task facing historians of Jesus was not the isolation and identification of authentic tradition amidst their interpretive overlays. Allison spent considerable energy attempting to demonstrate, quote, how facile is the usual assumption that a complex either originated with Jesus or with the church, close quote. He was similarly aware that the traditional criteria of authenticity did not actually enable the historian to differentiate authentic from inauthentic tradition. He did not, however, see any other way to speak about Jesus without the criteria, so he resigned himself to use them, even if critically. Over the ensuing decade, Allison only grew more disenchanted with the criteria. He also formulated a different approach to the question of the historical Jesus, one that depended heavily on memory studies. Now, this point requires emphasis. Allison did not appeal to memory studies as a new method for playing an old game. Although I liked your metaphor, I just think it's wrong. Allison sought to rewrite the rules and the goals of the game itself. Memory was not for Allison a safeguard or a guarantor of the reliability of the Jesus tradition. Rather, memory restructured Allison's conception of the Jesus tradition. That is, what he thought that tradition was, and it changed the way he worked with it to develop knowledge about Jesus. And this is where I think your analogy falls apart. The goal is still the same, knowledge about Jesus. So, if that's the traditional Jesus historiography, I want to think for a minute about Jesus in early Christian memory. In the space that remains, I want to look at a number of ideas that are emerging out of the current discussion. Taken together, these ideas do not move the old discussion forward, either by tilting the balance in favor of the gospel's reliability, Pace Bacchum, or by casting that reliability into further doubt, Pace Crook. Rather, these ideas bring the old discussion to a close, the end, and call for a new discussion, one that forestalls and leaves behind any talk of mixture or authenticity and inauthenticity and the criteria for distinguishing the two. So I'm going to offer 3 points. There are others, but in the interest of time, I'll just focus on these 3. First, historians cannot separate Jesus' past from his followers' present by prying a tradition from its literary and historical context. Let me say that again. Historians cannot separate Jesus' past from his followers' present by prying a tradition from its literary and historical context. At its core, Jesus' historiography is concerned with answering the question, did Jesus say or do such and such? In order to answer this question, historians examine sayings, events, complexes of tradition individually. Some historians elevate the isolation and decontextualization of individual traditions to programmatic status, and the results are not helpful. For example, one of Zeb's parents, the Jesus Seminar, narrowly decided to print Mark 2:17 in pink, their translation, since when do the able-bodied need a doctor? It's the sick who do. They describe the aphorism as a secular proverb, and they note a simpler parallel in Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 1224. Despite their explicit goal of uncovering the distinctive voice of Jesus, quote, the fellows decided that the saying sounded like Jesus, although it did not originate with him, close quote. However, they learned nothing about Jesus in the process. Here, again, quote, the attribution of a proverbial remark to Jesus tells us nothing in particular about him, except that he may have been familiar with such sayings, close quote. Now, Jesus may have spoken the words that the seminar is printed in pink, perhaps even more than once, but these words tell us nothing about Jesus. The evangelists, however, do not simply report that Jesus said, those who are strong do not need a doctor, but rather those who are ill. The evangelists marshal these words in service of a particular interpretation of Jesus, that Jesus associated with sinners and tax collectors rather than with the scribes of the Pharisees, Mark 2:16. Without this interpretive agenda, we have no reason whatsoever for thinking that Mark or any other early Christian would have remembered Jesus uttering these words. The interpretation our authors give these words in our text explains why they were remembered and were attributed to Jesus in the first place. Oral historian Elizabeth Tonkin has complained about this approach to isolating facts apart from the narrative representation that gave those facts meaning. This is a quote that Zeb pulled. Professional historians who use the recollections of others cannot just scan them for useful facts to pick out like currants from a cake. Any such facts are so embedded in the representation that it directs an interpretation of them, and its very ordering, its plotting, and its metaphors bear meaning too. Close quote. It's a great quote. Similarly, Ann Schroeder rightly questions whether, quote, it is possible to have access to purely historical data behind their interpretation in the sources, close quote. In other words, Mark 2:17 provides a dramatic affirmation of Prieske's claim that, quote, the interpretations of the past themselves are what preserve any connection to the actual past, close quote. Historians will still have to determine how and whether this image relates to the actual events of Jesus' life, but we were never able to authenticate the words of Mark 2:17 apart from the context in which we find them. So as I said, historians cannot separate Jesus' past from his followers' present by prying a tradition from its literary and historical context. My second point, historians have to account for the production as well as the reception of images of Jesus, regardless of those images' purported authenticity. We say it again, historians have to account for the production as well as the reception of images of Jesus, regardless of those images' purported authenticity. Redaction critical research has dominated New Testament scholarship for over 5 decades. As a method, redaction criticism has thrown the creative work of the evangelists into particularly sharp relief. However, redaction criticism has also blinded us to certain historical questions the method is not well suited for answering or even asking. Scholars have long been aware of the danger of treating a gospel's distinctive features as its characteristic features, but a different problem arises when we apply redaction critical methods of literary analysis to historical questions. And I'd like to turn to Luke's version of the Nazareth pericope to illustrate this problem. Redaction criticism enables us to note Luke's literary technique, whereby he's taken a narrative story from a later narrative moment in his source, Mark 6, 1 through 6, moved it to the beginning of Jesus' Galilean ministry, and then expanded it so that this pericope bears programmatic significance for the entire narrative of Luke Acts. In light of Luke's heavy redaction of Luke 4, historians have largely taken one of three tacks. First, some historians have simply dismissed the historical value of Luke's account altogether, since Luke has altered the story so dramatically, it speaks directly to Luke's interests and concerns toward the end of the first century, rather than the realities of Jesus' life closer to the beginning. Second, some have largely assumed that Luke's redaction accurately reflects the realities of Jesus' life. The argument generally goes that since Luke accurately describes synagogue services in Galilee in the first century, it must also reflect accurately what happened in Jesus' life. And then the third tack is that some will suggest that Luke had access to a source other than Mark and that Luke either preferred that source or he combined it with Mark. But all three of these approaches, I think, miss the point. The redaction-critical approach offers compelling explanations of Luke's production of an image of Jesus in the Nazareth synagogue, but it does not explain either why Luke should have wished to present this particular image, nor does it address why anyone should have accepted Luke's innovative presentation. American sociologist Barry Schwartz, who apparently is a member of the Trinity, cautions that a production of culture model, which we normally refer to as constructivism, neglects issues of reception, quote, which reflects those elements in the social environment that enhance public readiness to respond positively to entrepreneurs' claims, close quote. In other words, memory studies forefronts the question, why did Luke's redaction of the Nazareth pericope work? Anthony LaDunn, who's not published on Luke 4 specifically, offers a helpful model of thinking historically about Luke's redaction. LaDunn sets multiple interpretive trajectories alongside each other and pursues the set of historical circumstances that best explains all the data. I've written about the historical materials that enabled Luke's particular redaction of the Nazareth pericope and the value that historians can find in Luke's pericope and the ways that established images of Jesus constrain Luke's creativity in his presentation of the past. I want to emphasize this is an obviously distorted and manipulated passage. And Chris Keith has also focused on Luke's Nazareth pericope and the ways that Luke has reworked the reputation of Jesus in Mark and Matthew. Chris describes it there as a member of the manual labor class, and Luke has now positioned Jesus among the scribal educated class. In other words, memory studies has offered historians tools to reclaim Luke's Nazareth pericope as a source of historical information about Jesus, and it has done so without assuming uncritically that Luke simply retells what happened without any interpretive agenda. So my second point is historians have to account for the production as well as the reception of images of Jesus, regardless of those images' purported authenticity. And here's my third and final point. Historians have to account for the single most obvious fact arising from the Jesus tradition. This is true of canonical and non-canonical Jesus. That fact is, whatever the details of his life, Jesus of Nazareth was a powerful and dynamic vehicle for his followers' memory. In structuring early Christian memory, I framed my historical analysis in terms of this very question. I asked, why Jesus? Why did Jesus' followers choose him as a vehicle to address and conquer their concerns? Now, certainly, part of the answer must be that Jesus made an impression, or as Jimmy Dunn would say, an impact on those he encountered. And if so, we'll need to account for the ways that Jesus shaped his followers' perspective, the ways that they apprehended and responded to challenges in the present. Jesus is responsible for some of those ways, or at least something of those ways. In this sense, even traditions that do not actually go back to Jesus accurately reflect the Jesus of history. The creation of Jesus' tradition is guided by impulses that themselves go back to Jesus. And Dale Allison has excellent discussions of this in a number of places, especially his treatment of the temptation passages in Matthew and Luke, and Mark as well. However, just as Jesus' followers were defined by his impact on them, otherwise why would they speak about him so prolifically and to the neglect of other influential teachers? Just as Jesus' followers were defined by his impact on them, so also they actualized and utilized and interpreted their memories of Jesus in contexts that were not defined by him. The flip side of this question, why Jesus? Why did they choose him? The flip side of this question is that Jesus' followers always remembered him for their own reasons and in their own situations. We do not have to deny that they perceived Jesus' life and teachings as useful or appropriate for interpreting and responding to new situations like the gospel's diffusion into the diaspora, or the influx of Gentiles, or the destruction of the temple. We don't have to deny that they perceived Jesus as useful for these things, to recognize that Jesus' followers nevertheless recalled Jesus in and for their ever-shifting present. Barry Schwartz offers a model of keying, which helps us account for the function of Jesus as a vehicle of memory and a resource for interpreting new problems and orienting communities of Jesus' followers to those problems. And I'll quote him at length. Quote, Keen defines social memory's function, matching the past to the present, one as a model of society, reflecting its needs, interests, fears, and aspirations. Two, a model for society, a template for thought, sentiment, morality, and conduct. And three, a frame within which people find meaning for their experience. Social memory affects the present not only by reflecting it, but also, and more importantly, by shaping and framing individual experience. Close quote. Schwartz's model respects and accounts for that two-way movement between the past and the present, what I've elsewhere described as the mutually constitutive dialectic between past and present. So, we cannot assume an easy continuity between the past and the present, but neither can we approach the past and present as fundamentally disjoined. Remembering Jesus was necessarily remembering in the present, but Jesus' followers lived in a present that was already orientated in terms of the past of which Jesus was a part. So when we ask why Jesus' followers could create and attribute traditions to Jesus, the answer can only be that Jesus already oriented his followers to their present circumstances. When they responded to new situations, even situations that Jesus himself never faced, they did so precisely as followers of Jesus. I'll close with some thoughts on history and memory in the Gospels. Robert Miller aptly described the dominant conception of the task facing historians of Jesus, at least since Romanes, a conception that has reigned through the 20th century and that arguably still holds sway today. That is, Miller imagines the Gospels like the fields of the man whose enemies sowed weeds among his good seed. The historian's task is to discern the wheat from the tares, to uproot the tares, and to restore the Jesus of history, free from the corrupting interpretations of those who followed him. However, as memory theorists have taught us to expect, and as Chris Keith has powerfully expressed, the authentic memory of Jesus has been preserved in our sources because his followers found him useful and worth remembering in their later contexts. Memory theory teaches us not only to look for the historical Jesus precisely in his followers' interpretations of him, but it also gives us tools for conducting that search. As professional historians, we may find ourselves discomfited by the fact that our ability to discern historical reality has to work through rather than around the memories of Jesus' followers if we hope to have any authentic connection with the Jesus of history. Such is life. As Olick and Robbins explain, if experience is, quote, if experience is always embedded in and occurs through narrative frames, then there is no primal, unmediated experience that can be recovered. The distinction between history and memory in such accounts is a matter of disciplinary power rather than of epistemological prestige. Were it not for the interpretive work of his followers, the very thing that many of us try to account for and strip away, we would have no material at all, just as we have no data whatsoever of Jesus' next-door neighbor, any of his aunts or uncles, or the synagogue leader in his hometown. Thank you.
Okay, our final speaker is Paul Foster. Memory, help or hindrance in historical Jesus research. Paul.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. My paper's arranged in 3 sections. First of all, what is historical Jesus research? Then, getting to the nub of the question, I want to ask, what is the contribution or role of memory in historical Jesus research? And unsurprisingly, I will end with a conclusion, or at least that's the plan at this stage. So, what is historical Jesus research? Perhaps the first step in assessing whether memory or memory studies can assist historical Jesus research is to have a clear indication of what historical Jesus research is and what its goals might be. However, let me first be totally upfront with you. I do think memory studies are of value, especially in terms of tracing the transmission and mutation of Jesus' traditions. Memory studies can provide added traction for understanding the forces that shape the forms in which traditions were passed on within texts, or community settings. That is what has typically been described as Traditionsgeschichte approach. Social memory theory, therefore, is helpful in that it examines the way that texts or groups redeploy their own formative myths in ways that sustain the ongoing life of the community. That is without doubt valuable work. However, you knew that was coming, didn't you? However, my contention is the following, namely that such research, important as it is not historical Jesus research as it is typically understood. But on that last point, please do not trust me. Here is a survey of some statements concerning the purpose of historical Jesus research from several major scholars spanning the last part of the 20th and early part of the 21st centuries. In what is perhaps one of the best known and pictorially imaginative statements, J.P. Meyer explains historical Jesus research in the following manner, using the fantasy of the unpapal conclave. That might have been written in the days of John Paul II or of Ratzinger. Maybe he'd be happier these days to have the Pope involved, I don't know. He says, suppose that a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, and an agnostic, all honest historians, it's good we have no dishonest historians, isn't it? Cognizant of first century religious movements, were locked in the bowels of Harvard Divinity School, put on a Spartan diet, and not allowed to emerge until they had hammered out a consensus document on who Jesus of Nazareth was and what he intended in his own time and place. The basic requirement that the consensus document be open to verification by any and all persons using the means of modern historical research would produce a narrow focus, a fragmentary vision, perhaps even distortions, end quote. Meyer places great store in the objectivity of the historical method, perhaps too much confidence in historiography, which often requires in itself individual value judgments and subjective perspectives. However, his basic understanding of the goal of historical Jesus research remains fairly standard, even if his belief in the method's ability to produce results that could be replicated by objective inquirers neglects the degree of subjectivity involved in historical judgments. The impossibility of absolute objectivity is recognized by J.D. Crossan, who states that he is not concerned with, I quote, an unobtainable objectivity, but with an obtainable honesty. Yet what is obtainable for Crossan is presented as being demonstrable through the source-critical and historical analysis of gospel traditions. From this viewpoint, the importance of historical plausibility as a datum for historical Jesus research is central. The interplay between determinations concerning sources and the likelihood of traditions originating with Jesus of Nazareth has been widely recognized. Thus, Tyson and Merck state, the closer a source brings us to the historical Jesus, the more important it is. Therefore, it is important to determine the age of the sources, end quote. The historical method, of course, is not without its limitations, and the criticism that it is a minimalistic approach needs to be squarely acknowledged. Thus, as Witherington eloquently states, what is true about historical Jesus and what the historical method can demonstrate are not one and the same. The latter will always at best be a truncated version of the former. More recently, Dale Allison has flagged up the same question in his invaluable study, Constructing Jesus. Allison first asks what he considers to be the chief question of historical Jesus research. I quote, "How much history can we show the Gospels to have preserved?" He then glosses this question in a footnote with the following observation: how much history do the Gospels preserve is a different question with a different answer. My concern is with the less than omniscient historians who must leave many questions unanswered. Hence, Allison recognizes that the central concern of historical Jesus research revolves around those traditions that can be demonstrably linked to the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth with a high degree of probability. Notwithstanding this limitation, which leads to the recognition that the historical Jesus is not identical with the real Jesus, the historical method remains the best method for determining a reasonably secure set of traditions that have a good possibility of originating with Jesus. One must be honest enough to admit that this historical method itself is not some pristine tool that allows unadulterated access to the past, whatever a pure depiction of the past might be. Thus, as Sanders observes, there is, as usual in dealing with historical questions, no opening which does not involve one in a circle of interpretation. That is, historians always depend on the kind of circle that involves moving from evidence to tentative conclusions, then back to evidence with renewed insight, and so on. There are obvious limits in applying the historical method to historical Jesus research. Moreover, understandings of historiography itself have developed greatly since the beginning of the 20th century. Few, if any, would want to claim that there exists some pure version of history that can be accessed by the application of more rigorous and objective methods. It is widely recognized that there is a perspectival dimension in all accounts of past events. Yet this should not necessarily entail a sense of despondency about doing history, nor should it lead to an abandonment of the discipline of historical Jesus research. Despite wise caveats concerning the perspectival nature of history, it is not necessary to fully embrace the entire postmodern agenda with its thoroughgoing relativization of history and truth itself. It is still legitimate to ask what is perhaps the basic historical Jesus question about Jesus' sayings and actions. In an unnuanced form, the question at the heart of historical Jesus research is still, did Jesus do or say some reported tradition? In a more nuanced form, and in a less stark dichotomy, one can ask about the likelihood of a saying or action being attributable to Jesus of Nazareth during his earthly ministry, and the degree to which that action or tradition might have been mutated in the process of transmission and retelling. These are no doubt hard questions to answer. However, while the man from Nazareth remains such an influential force in not only human history, but in the contemporary life of believing communities, it is unsurprising that people wish to assess the level of confidence they can place in transmitted traditions as reflections of the core message of Jesus. As such, I would contend that solid historical Jesus research must remain one of the central questions of New Testament scholarship. Part 2. What is the role of memory in historical Jesus research? One section of a paper I previously published with the very mild title, Memory, Orality in the Fourth Gospel, 3 Dead Ends in Historical Jesus Research, as the first term in the title suggests, made a critique of the application of memory studies to historical Jesus research. In particular, that discussion examined claims concerning the reliability of memory studies as a means of validating traditions concerning Jesus as being historically accurate. Before developing the thesis further and responding to some of the critiques made on blogs, please let me quote part of the admittedly overlong concluding sentence to that section. The article stated, where social memory theory may provide insights into the Jesus tradition is by analyzing how such memories were received and by reflecting on their pastoral or pedagogical function that might have worked in early believing communities. In other words, if that statement is not sufficiently clear, let me say it again. I believe there is a value in the application of memory theory for understanding the development and transmission of the Jesus tradition. Moreover, rightly applied, insights from studies on memory may even help scholars to determine why certain collective memories became resilient and retained greater utility in the early believing Jesus communities. As I see it, my discussion was basically the critique of the application of a fairly recent methodology to historical Jesus research. For some, it was seen as more than that. While my good friend Michael Bird mutually announced the publication of the article on his blog under the heading Paul Foster's Grenade in the Playground of Historical Jesus Studies, others felt far more was at stake. One kindly soul, who had great pastoral concern for my eternal salvation, offered up the following comment on Bird's blog site. He addressed it to Michael Bird as follows: "Your friend, Dr. Paul, needs to meet Jesus, develop a healed and forgiven relationship with him, and then choose something more profitable to do with his mind. I fear that 'get away from me, I never knew you' is looming large in the good doctor's future." I guess all I can say to that is, amen, brother. All those scholars should keep away from the Bible. Yet, notwithstanding that warning, I will, in peril of eternal damnation, continue to say something concerning what I see to be the limitation, or better still, misapplication, of memory studies to historical Jesus research. In the section of the article dealing with memory, my primary dialogue partner from within the Guild of Biblical Studies was Professor Richard Borkham. Let me say something about that choice. Borkham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, has received lavish praise, critical acclaim, and has been awarded both the Christianity Today Award in Biblical Studies 2007 and the Michael Ramsey Prize 2009. In this volume, Borkham advances the following thesis concerning the reliability of memory as a means of gaining access to the historical life of Jesus of Nazareth. To quote, "The eyewitnesses who remembered the events of the history of Jesus were remembering inherently very memorable events, unusual events that would have impressed themselves on the memory, events of key significance for those who remembered them, landmark or life-changing events for them in many cases, and their memories would have been reinforced and stabilized by frequent rehearsal, beginning very soon after the event. We may conclude that memories of eyewitnesses of the history of Jesus score highly by the criteria for likely reliability that have been established by the psychological study of recollected memory." End quote. The reasons for interacting with Borkham are basically twofold. First, he makes the clearest claim that, quote, "the psychological study of recollected memory," end quote, helps to establish the historical reliability of Jesus traditions. That is, he believes the fundamental question of historical Jesus research, namely whether a saying or deed can be attributed to the earthly activities of Jesus, is resolved through appeal to modern study of memory theory. Unambiguously, Borkham understands what is at stake at the heart of historical Jesus research, and he asserts that memory is an important breakthrough in establishing the historical reliability of gospel traditions. The second reason for focusing on Borkham revolves around the impact of his work. Borkham is a senior and deservedly much respected scholar. Not only is his work widely cited, but in some circles it is seen as a major advance in historical Jesus studies. And as has been stated, the Eyewitnesses book has received various laureations. Notwithstanding such praise, my contention is that the application of memory studies to the Jesus tradition in the manner undertaken by Borkham is a major methodological misjudgment, and moreover the conclusions he draws do not any way follow from the misapplication of the psychological study of memory. In a way, I feel that interacting with such a senior scholar who claims to offer a major development in historical Jesus studies, requires no justification. However, I am driven to make such a defense in the face of a criticism on Professor Keith's blog. In response to my hopefully constructive critique of Borkham, Keith wrote on his blog, "Foster ignores scholars such as me, Rafael Rodriguez, Anthony Ledon et al., who employ social memory and conclude against the historicity of various traditions." The simple response to this is that I did not cite Professor Keith because I did not have disagreement with his work. He is not making the claims that Borkham makes regarding the historical reliability of memory. As I've tried to show, Borkham is a central and highly esteemed figure, making arguments about historical Jesus research. My article was published in the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus, and hence, unsurprisingly, it focused on historical Jesus issues. Why would I distract from the main point of my argument, which was only a third of the article, by bringing in extraneous material? I realize at this point I must apologize for being old school, but I was taught to stick with the point one is making and not to have pretentious footnotes to show how much one knows. Thus, in my article, the footnotes are present only to support the central thesis. Furthermore, I know that I personally do not occupy the same rank in our discipline as Professor Borkham, so I would not expect future works necessarily to reference my article. Admittedly, I am thrilled when my work is cited, but maybe non-citation is a truer reflection of impact, and thus I hope I'm not so fragile or thin-skinned that when my work is not cited, that I take it as a personal affront. Rather, it probably shows that my writing did not speak to the question being addressed, or, especially in relation to my own work, that it was not of sufficient substance to warrant interaction. Those caveats aside concerning the nature of the response on certain blog sites, let me restate succinctly my argument concerning the place of social memory theory in relation to historical Jesus research. First, I set out two predominant formulations of social memory theory, not from within the discipline of New Testament studies, but by drawing upon the literature within the scholarly field of psychology, where such memory theory arose and continues to be developed. The first theory discussed is the presentist model. It argues that social memory becomes social fact as it is remade to serve contemporary values and needs. Hence, memory is reconstructed in different ways as it is invoked in a variety of groups. Therefore, notable features, according to the presentist model, is that memory becomes context-dependent. The second theory, which does not hold the same following as the presentist model, is the cultural system model. In distinction from the presentist model, it views social memory as having some degree of alignment with past events. Nonetheless, the relationship between past and present remains far from unproblematic. On this model, the kernel of historical reality that may be embedded in politically overlaid social memory has been remolded in order to communicate contemporary beliefs. Therefore, neither model gives simple, let alone pristine, access to a reliable historical recollection. Moreover, community or social memories are reconceptualizations of the past that reinscribe such recollections in a form that makes them useful vehicles for carrying the communal function of establishing permanent stability and duration, coupled with a sense of rootedness that allows for the individual to construct a sense of belonging and connectedness. I'm going to move on to an example, a contemporary example. We asked for blood in this session, so I'm going to look at the Eucharist here. This can be illustrated by consideration of a contemporary Eucharistic practice. The breaking of bread and the sharing of wine That was for Catholics here. For Protestants, obviously there's no blood involved, I hasten to add. The breaking of bread and the sharing of wine are events not of historical reenactment, but done in memorial of the one who presided at the primordial meal. Both the form of the liturgical act and the words used are historically removed from what may have happened when Jesus and his disciples shared what may have been some kind of Passover meal. Despite the distance between the original event and modern masses, Eucharists, communion services, or Lord's Supper, the claim of a historical connection is a powerful device for legitimating the contemporary ceremony. The rhetoric is that, as the Lord Jesus Christ did on the night he was betrayed, so those in believing communities continue to do now. If it were possible to play the video of that initial first century meal alongside a modern Eucharistic celebration in some kind of elaborate spot the difference game, I'm certain the differences column would be very full, whereas the similarities column would be very empty. Obviously, there is a difference between the case of comparing contemporary Eucharistic practice to the hypothetical form of the foundational event and trying to determine which gospel traditions might have a strong possibility of stemming from the earthly Jesus. However, I believe heuristically it is useful. It shows that commemorated or memorialized events function to serve contemporary communal needs rather than as unpolluted repositories of documentary history. In fairness, I know that Chris Keith and Rafael Rodriguez believe precisely that. Their works carefully trace the need and the way early memories in Jesus communities have been formulated to serve those needs. Rodriguez in particular discusses this very phenomenon in his monograph under the substantial section Expressions of the Past as Phenomena in the Present. The critique of memory theory undertaken here, as in my previous discussion, remains the same as I stated previously. It is not a rejection of memory studies per se, but a rebuttal of the application of those insights as taken over from psychological studies and uncritically applied to validate vast swathes of Jesus' tradition as being historically reliable. Such acts of validation are usually claimed en masse, rather than working through specific pericope. As an aside from one who works on the non-canonical Gospels, if it were the case that social memory theory established the historicity of the canonical Gospel traditions to the extent proposed by Borkham, then it is difficult to accept his grounds for rejecting those traditions contained in the non-canonical Gospels. For instance, while the Gospel of Peter meets Borkham's own indicator of reliability by preserving the name of a minor character when a centurion who witnesses the resurrection is named as Petronius, instead of this becoming an indicator of historical reliability, Borkham invokes a different set of criteria. His argument devolves into traditional discussions of dating, source dependency, to show that this memory is neither early nor independent. I agree with Borkham's assessment in this case, but simply wonder why the same principles are not used to assess traditions in the canonical text. Or was I just forgetting that the four Gospels of the New Testament are canonical and hence sacred and must be found to be historically reliable? To conclude, my argument is not that memory studies are to the Jesus tradition what homeopathy is to modern medicine. Quite the opposite. I think memory studies can offer much for understanding both the transmission and development of gospel traditions. In many ways, mutatis mutandis, memory studies perhaps bring fresh methodological resources to address similar questions to those discussed by both form critics as well as those interested in the early reception of the text. While I remain largely committed to standard methods for assessing historical Jesus questions, this is not some intransigent commitment to those methods for their own sake. If a new methodology is developed that provides a better mechanism for determining the historical reliability of Jesus' traditions, then I would be delighted to see that occur. In the meantime, we have what we have. The results that the traditional methods offer are meagre, and we would wish for more than is verifiable. The danger is that we allow the desire for more to dissolve our methodological rigor, which is essential for genuine historical Jesus research. As scholars, that is a desire I believe we must resist, both individually and collectively, in meetings such as this. Thank you.
Okay, we have quite a bit of time for questions, but I thought we could have, if people wanted to respond individually in the order, I'll give them 2 minutes each or something like that. Is that okay? Chris?
Thanks again to my colleagues here. This has been very enlightening for me, and I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it. To Zeb's, and I should say straight out, I agree entirely with Zeb and with Paul that social memory theory does not affirm the historical authenticity of the Gospels. I also think that the theory itself does not affirm the historical inauthenticity of the Gospels. The theory, as theory, does neither one. It just gives us a means to have the conversation. So in my opinion, these presentations in many ways reiterated my point that I honestly think this entire discussion is off track. But I think it's interesting that in Zeb's article, he makes the point that that memory can be reliable and it can be unreliable, and that's entirely right. But then he concludes here that that we can't have the historical Jesus discussion because of this issue, reliable versus unreliable.